Okay, welcome everybody to the first London Financial Regulation seminar this term. Very delighted to have Dr. Calvin Jackson with us today. He's has a long experience background as a consultant on executive remuneration. He has quite some experience as an anti-bar as well in regulatory matters. And he's also just finished his PhD on the topics. And today he'll be presenting that work on the professional standards of executive remuneration consultants. We're very pleased to have him today, and I'll give the floor to you, Calvin.
Thank you, Catherine. I think I'll just put some sort of tent pegs down for a moment or two, just so that we all know the context where I'm speaking from. That I spent about 25 years as an executive remuneration consultant, advising committees around the world, mostly in financial services. And I'm sure everyone tuning into this seminar will know the way remuneration committees work. They're composed or comprised of non-executive directors, with the company chairman normally a member of the committee, but not the chairman of the committee. And with quoted companies, they're usually advised by an executive remuneration consultancy to provide them with independent advice on the structure and quantum of remuneration packages. And I thought I'd start with a few quotes just to set the scene. And Christine, these aren't on the slides, so don't show the slides just for a moment, please. But I just want to share with you some of the bad things people have said about remuneration consultants, because once I've done that, what I hope to do in the presentation is to impress upon you that I, for example, am a very strong believer in responsible capitalism and a strong believer in companies behaving properly and those who advise them having high professional standards. But let me set the scene for a moment with some quotes that show remuneration consultants in not such a good light. First of all, there was Lord Miners, who so sadly died over the last weekend. Now, I never actually crossed him and thought he was actually a bit of a friendly teddy bear, as it were, but he was famously skeptical of remuneration consultants. And one of the examples he gave when he was a remuneration committee chair in financial services was that he called for all the previous drafts of the Remuneration Committee Advisors report on a particular matter. And he said he couldn't remember whether there were 5 or 7 drafts, but what he could remember was that every draft had gone to management first, and that every draft showed the proposals or the recommendations regarding those management increasing in terms of quantum with every draft that went by. Now, that was 15 years ago, and remuneration committee circulation protocols these days are very much for the remuneration committee chair to see the drafts ever before they go to management. But there's an example of someone saying that remuneration consultants haven't always behaved properly. Another example would be Grafe Crystal back in the late 1990s, who was an executive pay consultant in the States, but who then retired and wrote very widely on the problems of executive pay in his book called In Search of Excess. And what he said was executive compensation in the United States didn't go out of control simply through some random process. It went out of control because of the actions or inactions of a number of parties. The first culprits in what will be a litany of culprits are compensation consultants. So there's a second one for you. A third one is Warren Buffett, of course, of Berkshire Hathaway. If you hire a compensation consultant after I'm gone, I'll come back mad. Another one, Charlie Munger, his CFO. I would rather put a viper down my shirt front than hire a compensation consultant. Then Lord Lawson at a House of Commons Select Committee. Remuneration consultants are a profession that makes prostitutes seem thoroughly respectable. I did rather blanch at that one. Luckily, I was not giving evidence on that day, but I know who was, and she was a lady who was a very respected consultant, and I'm amazed she didn't throttle him. She was extremely polite back to him. And one of the reasons after I retired as a consultant that I wanted to do a serious piece of academic research on executive remuneration consultants was that at the time of the global financial crisis, so if we go back to 2008, an FT journalist rang me up, and I'd had conversations with him before, and he said, eventually, Calvin, there's no point talking to you because you've been captured by boards. And I thoroughly disagreed with what he said. And I vowed to myself, if I ever had the opportunity to do a proper piece of academic research to disprove what he was saying, then I would actually do so. I think the last thing I'd say before going into the presentation is that anyone doing a biography or even an autobiography needs to be careful about separating themselves from the subject they're talking about. But actually, my wife over Christmas gave me a copy of Ranulph Fiennes, you know the famous explorer, his biography of Sir Ernest Shackleton. So all about the Antarctic and everything that happened there. And what Ranulph Fiennes started the book with was a quote, "In writing about hell, it helps to have been there." Now, I'm not saying for a moment that it was hell being a remuneration consultant. It certainly wasn't. But actually, having been there for 25 plus years, and hopefully being able to separate myself out from the work, the academic work I've done, that it does actually help if you've earned your living doing something, if you're talking about it. So Christine, should we go to the first slide? I think we ought to go on to the second one, don't you? Here we go. I believe executive pay is a really important topic, and lots of people have written about this, John Kay in particular, and the premise is that if the electorate doesn't have faith in the capitalist system, then what the capitalist system can do for them if it's operating properly in providing good jobs and the taxes to pay for good public services goes rather by the board. And at the time of the global financial crisis and afterwards, there are all sorts of concerns about pay, and the concept of responsible capitalism rather came to the fore, with companies basically having a figurative license to operate, and they need to behave properly if the electorate is going to be happy with them. Otherwise, you'll get what George Orwell used to call a tug from below. And a tug from below from the electorate would be saying to people who were involved in pay, we really, really, really don't like what you're doing, and we're going to vote in a certain way to punish you for that. Christine, can we go on to the next slide? I'm currently writing a book, as Catherine was saying. It'll be published by Routledge probably right at the tail end of this year on the professional standards of executive remuneration consultants. Most of my work was either in the UK, but an awful lot of it was on the continent, in America, or even in the Far East, and lots in the Middle East as well. I feel like Chris Whitty here, or Sir Chris Whitty. Christine, can you give us the next slide, please? I was invited to return to the bar, fully 10 years ago now. In the meantime, I've been a disciplinary panel chair with one of the UK professional bodies. So I, together with my fellow panel members, have been sitting in judgment, as it were, on members of a UK profession in terms of their professional behaviour. But I've combined that with the Institute of Advanced Legal Studies, doing an LLM in financial regulation, and then a PhD, which started in 2000. The PhD started in 2015 and finished in 2020. I was obviously not doing it full time, but what I was doing was doing a piece of empirical research as opposed to a doctrinal PhD. And doing a piece of empirical research, one of the advantages was that it was grounded in real life, but actually it took much longer to do than a piece of doctrinal research, because I had to set up, and I'll go through this later, a whole load of executive interviews, and then have them all transcribed and then code them and proceed on that basis. So my perspective is that for 25 years, basically from 1985 to 2011, I had a ringside seat on how remuneration consultancy developed in the UK. And I've spent 7 or 8 of the 10 years since then doing this empirical research program. Christine, can we move on? Love them or hate them, I don't think anyone would say that remuneration consultants didn't play a key part in the remuneration pay determination process. It's a sort of process where you have the remuneration committee, you have the independent consultants advising the committee, and then you have the in-house executive reward specialists who are providing the data, but also the company context for what's being advised on. And they may carry a variety of titles, head of HR, head of executive reward, head of reward. They may even be the company secretary or even the general counsel. They can all specialize in executive pay. It's crucial that the advice provided to committees is independent advice, and I'll be covering that later. And the professional standards of consultants is obviously a key part of whether that advice is suitably independent. So I'll be talking about professional standards, things like technical expertise, the length of experience of the consultants, plus ethical and training considerations regarding those consultants. Christine, can we move on? I think you all know that executive remuneration in the UK is a classic piece of self-regulation. And as part of my doctorate, I looked at, for example, how after Big Bang, financial services was regulated with the SROs and the constituent bodies such as IMRO, Loutro, and people like that, and how that was sort of trainer wheels regulation that eventually came under the Financial Services Authority and now the Financial Conduct Authority. That's an example in financial services of self-regulation moving right the way through to state-sponsored regulation. Executive remuneration is still very much in the self-regulation stage. The Remuneration Consultants Group was set up at the instigation of Sir David Walker back in 2009. And there are 11 member firms at the moment of the Remuneration Consultants Group. They're made up of 2 of the big 4 chartered accountancy firms, such as PwC and Deloitte, 2 of the actuarial and benefit consultants, like Willis, Towers Watson and Mercer, and a number of boutiques like Pearlmeyer, like Fit Remuneration Consulting. And the basic message in the UK is that the vast majority of fee income goes to the big 4 and the actuarial and benefit consultants. They advise most of the big remuneration committees. The boutiques 5 years ago were very much out of the picture in the UK. But actually in the UK now, they're actually growing and becoming much more influential as clients appreciate totally independent advice. In America, the boutiques took over almost completely, or very largely, about 10 years ago, with SEC regulations being introduced on independence and fee disclosure for consultancy services that favored boutiques. In the UK, it's very much a business advisory services, as opposed to fiduciary obligations. What I mean by that, anyone who wants to compare the external auditor's role with that of the appointed remuneration consultant, it's so different, it's almost unbelievable. The external auditors have got all sorts of things they need to do and all sorts of declarations they need to make, for example, if they decide to stand down. Whereas remuneration consultants, rather like management consultants, strategy consultants, are basically a niche business advisory service. There's no specialized accreditation, qualification, nor license to practice for remuneration consultants. So it's not like being a doctor. It's not like being a teacher. It's not like even being a vicar where you need a license. It is business advisory work. It isn't one of the sort of classic liberal professions, which would have been, as you'll all know, law, medicine, and the church, all of them needing a license. But executive consultants at the most senior level, of whom in the UK, if you're being generous, you'd say they're 50 at the most senior level, about 250 consultants overall. But actually, if you're looking for headline names as consultants, you'd be hard put to get beyond 10, quite frankly. So it's a tiny business at the most senior level. In fact, it's a tiny business, even if you include every consultant. If you compare that to chartered accountants, there are 440,000 chartered accountants in the UK, and there are 140,000 solicitors. So it's a tiny, tiny business. But most of the senior people are actuaries, chartered accountants, tax advisors, lawyers, or MBAs. I started life as a lawyer, but worked in the tax practice of one of the big four for quite a number of years. Christine, do you want to turn over? Well, this is an easy slide. I've already done half of it. So I'll go on to the third bullet point. Most people would argue that it's too small a profession for a full-blown set of examinations and disciplinary sanction for individual consultants. But that was one of the issues covered in my research. I asked all of the 53 interviewees whether it would be a good idea to actually have a separate accreditation, separate license to practice, and disciplinary sanction for individual consultants. The Remuneration Consultants Group makes it crystal clear it is not a trade body. What it does, it has a voluntary code of conduct, which it monitors and reviews on a regular basis. And it says it's yet to receive a single complaint about a member firm in 12 years, nor individual consultants. Now, that is a statement of fact I'm sure is true because they say it's the case. But of course, it's very easy for companies if the remuneration committee does not like the advice it is receiving, or it feels that the remuneration consultant is incompetent or simply is not simpatico in some shape or form, then they can simply sack that consultant and have another one from the firm concerned, or it can simply have a tender process and appoint another firm. So it's not so much necessary for complaints to be made. It's pretty easy to change a consultant, but the boot is actually on the other foot as well. If a consultant feels that their client is not behaving in a way that they feel comfortable with, for one reason or another, they can simply say, I no longer wish to advise you, and hand back the appointment, either to someone else within their firm, or it can go to another firm at that point. And almost every consultant has actually been sacked at some stage because the committee doesn't like the advice they're receiving for one reason or another. Almost every consultant has actually I put this in inverted quotes, sacked their client because they no longer feel comfortable with advising that client. Christine, should we move on? When I was doing my LLM on financial regulation, I did a dissertation on executive pay in 2014, and I identified 6 big issues in executive pay that may or may not need addressing. For example, short-termism, incentive plan design, and corporate ethics behavior. One of those was the professional standards for executive remuneration consultants. And the conclusion I came to back in 2014 was that although certain of those big 6 issues may well merit reform, my hypothesis for the doctoral research that followed my LLM was the current UK regulation and practice for remuneration consultants was broadly appropriate. In other words, the big 6 issues, there were things that I definitely said needed reform, but the professional standards of remuneration consultants, I did not consider needed reform. So I took that out as my doctoral hypothesis to my 53 interviewees on a semi-structured questionnaire basis to ask them for their views on that and various other matters. The main research was carried out in 2016, but I updated that in the summer of last year. So I did 53 interviews originally, and then I re-interviewed a subsection of those interviewees last summer. Christine, can we move on? You may say, where was I coming from in all this? And you'll all be aware of the difference between quantitative research and qualitative research. The vast majority of research into executive pay is highly quantitative. It's things like, what is the link between executive pay and business performance, matters of that sort. And you get reams and reams of calculations, which comes up with various causations, or if you're lucky, causation. So sorry, correlations, or if you're lucky, causation. Now you can compare that with qualitative research. And what qualitative research does is you go out and interview a selection of people who should know what they're talking about or have something interesting to say. And the qualitative research on executive remuneration consultants over the last 15 years has been done by people like Bender, Adamson, Bender and Franca-Santos and DeGan. And they looked at executive remuneration consultants and the advice they provided to remuneration committees. However, what my work has been doing very much in more detail is I've looked at the professional standards of executive remuneration consultants and also in-house executive reward specialists. Now, DeGan did look at in-house executive reward specialists, but more in relation to the advisory relationship they had with the remuneration committee and consultants, not looking so much at the professional standards of the specialists involved. So what I would submit is the work I've done follows very much in the footsteps of those folks mentioned above there. It's qualitative and it's empirical, and it looks at the professional standards of those 2 constituents, consultants and reward specialists. And the way I did it was doing semi-structured interviews, with several questionnaires. There was a main questionnaire and then a supplementary questionnaire. And the people I interviewed were remuneration committee chairs or members, consultants, reward specialists, institutional shareholder bodies, proxy advisors, city lawyers who are involved in company commercial work, and also regulators, and also the government department involved. Christine, do you want to move on? Now, if anything I've said is not startling to date, I hope this next bullet point is going to be startling. Normally, when people send out invitations for doctoral research programs, they may have to send out, and I'm only making up the numbers here, 150 invitations to get 30 or 40 acceptances, to actually get 10 or 15 actual completed interviews. I sent out 59 interviews. I got 56 acceptances. I had 53 completed interviews. The 3 dropouts were all for good reasons. Like, for example, the person who agreed had left the firm in question and hadn't moved ahead to another one, or had retired, things like that. And I also updated it with interviews only last year, and I covered 18 research aspects. And before I get onto the detail of the results, I thought I'd tell you the end. It's a bit like a film, this, isn't it? I thought I'd tell you the end at the beginning so that you can bear it in mind for when I'm going on about the research process and the results. There was incredibly strong evidence to support my research hypothesis that at the present time, there doesn't appear to be a case for new hard or soft law regulation on the professional standards of consultants. Should we move on, Christine? So the first thing I looked at was the working relationship between consultants and remuneration committees. And I will cover in the slides the actual results, but I'm going to set the scene here. So the first thing I covered was the working relationships. The second thing was, are consultants genuinely independent and objective? Then I looked at the business of consultancy in the UK and the US. Who are the big players? What are the regulations? And what are the practices? For example, in remuneration committee advisory protocols, regulations for things like what are the disclosure of the fees charged for remuneration committee advice, and what happens if the consultancy concerned provides other services to the company in question, things like that. And the players, whether it was Big Four, whether it was actuarial and benefit consultancies or boutiques. I asked a whole load of questions about that. Also, self-regulation in the UK and US. How is the Remuneration Consultants Group working? Why isn't there something like the Remuneration Consultants Group in the United States, for example? Then I went on to the in-house executive reward specialists. How do they get on with the committee? How do they get on with the appointed consultants? How do they cope with the conflicts of interest? Because of course, if a consultant falls out with the remuneration committee, as I've already said, the committee can sack them, or the consultant can just abandon the appointment. But if you actually work for the company concerned, and your ultimate boss is the CEO of the company concerned, then the in-house executive reward specialist has got quite a lot of potential conflicts to work their way through. So let's deal with the results on professional standards. Christine, can we move on? So the first thing I looked at was the technical expertise of the consultants concerned. How many years of experience they've got, what sort of training they get specifically on boardroom present, how to cope with the ethical problems that can arise. And anyone who's been in a professional capacity will have a ton of war stories about problems with ethics. For remuneration consultancy, a classic example may be one is advising the committee and the chief executive rings you up out of the blue and starts asking you all sorts of questions about their pay, the sources of data, what you're going to recommend, etc. And of course, in those situations, you have to say, love you to death, happy to talk to you. I have to clear it with the remuneration committee before we go any further. Once I've done that, we can have a nice chat. Otherwise, go away. In terms of a lawyer, when I was a little baby lawyer many years ago, an example would be I defended a chap for living off immoral earnings. And the trial was a success, of course, they got off. But then he said, wow, fantastic. the day's not over. Would you like to come back to the premises? And it's yours, all free for the evening. Of course, I had to disappear at the rate of knots. But that's the sort of ethical situation that anyone gets in any business. We looked at whether there should be a specialized accreditation or qualification and or license to practice. There are some accreditations for remuneration consultants, but not really specialized ones, and no real specialized qualifications at the moment. Those who have a license to practice, supposing they're chartered accountants or actuaries, may actually get themselves into hot water with their own professional body, such as the Institute of Actuaries. You could end up, they're overseen, of course, by the FRC. So you could end up being dragged before the FRC for disciplinary sanctions, but there's nothing specifically as a remuneration consultant. Other things I covered were, should there be a shareholders binding vote on the appointment of consultants? That was a popular idea from the Labour Party at about the time of the GFC. Should there be a shareholders annual binding vote on the director's remuneration report as opposed to an advisory one? Pay ratio disclosure, well, of course, there is now pay ratio disclosure. Workers on the board, well, of course, there are now, not compulsory, but there's several ways of doing it. And how are fees charged for other services? Supposing, well, let's give an example, a big four firm appointed to advise the remuneration committee does a host of taxation and or accountancy advice for the company concerned. They won't be the external auditors, because if a big four firm is an external auditor, they will not put themselves in the frame for being the remuneration committee consultants. Can we move on, Christine? So what I did is, I did all this on my own, and I took all of the interview responses. So every interview virtually was taped. So then I had it transcribed, and then I ascribed responses, positive, mid-position, or negative, depending on how people had responded to the various questions. There was an awful lot of consensus from the interviewees. So whether they were remuneration committee chairs, regulators, or consultants or in-house people, then they were pretty all in one direction. But on certain things, there was a split. One was on the remuneration committee advisory scene. There was a three-way split there. So some were positive about it, thought it was working well. Some were negative, thought it was working badly, and some were in the middle. Genuinely independent and objective on consultants, well, that was much the same. And the working relationship, how things were going, as opposed to the broader advisory scene, were generally pretty positive. There were a few negative comments, and on consultants' conflicts of interest, again, positive, but with a few negative comments. Christine, should we go on? On ethics and professional standards, there was a split there between the positive and mid-position, but you see negative didn't really come into it at all. And again, technical expertise and experience split between positive and mid-position. Again, negative hardly came into it at all. And when you compare the massive criticism of external auditors, for example, that's been going on for the last few years with things like the Bryden report and things like that, the CMA report, and the criticism of whether the big four should be split, whether the consultancy bit, which would include remuneration committee advice, should be split from auditing, things like that. There's a huge amount of criticism of external auditors, very, very little of remuneration consultants. Now, you may say that's because they've been clever at being under the radar screen, or it may be that there isn't too much to complain about. On whether there should be a specialized qualification, predominantly negative. In other words, there shouldn't be one, but some people did think there should be one, or thought that there might be one in the mid-position. On licensed practice, the vast majority said no, there shouldn't be. it's business advice, etc. But some people were in the positive or the mid position. Christine, can we move on? On professional standards, on the UK regulatory regime and RCG, again, that's predominantly mid position, but some positive and some negative. And in my research, I have actually proposed some changes RCG might like to think about in terms of the training of consultants, turning it, not actually bringing the training in-house at RCG, but actually having them mastermind case studies and making sure all of the providers reached at least a certain level of training. And for in-house specialists on conflict of interest, predominantly mid-position, some positive, some negative. Christine, should we move on? So all in all, there's a pretty limited appetite for regulatory or practice reform. Now, please remember, I'm only talking about the professional standards of executive remuneration consultants and their in-house colleagues. I'm not talking about executive pay more broadly. And what we found was scarcely surprising, really, because at a very senior level, almost all of the consultants are professionally qualified. It's a tiny, tiny profession, 250 people, under 50 really senior ones, perhaps 10 real rainmakers, and it's not getting any bigger. Is there a question of a lack of resources or infrastructure for a specialized qualification, exams and a disciplinary process? I know from being disciplinary panel chair of a professional body, just how much effort goes into the disciplinary process. You've got to investigate it fairly, and then you've got to have a hearing, for example. And in terms of examinations, well, anyone who's done the law exams, tax exams, accountancy exams, know just how difficult it is to set those exams and mark them, etc. And the position at the moment is that there is arguably a competitive oligopoly of two big four, two actuarial and benefit consultancies. But the big boutiques, well, the small boutiques are actually growing and may one day become quite big boutiques if we follow the way things have developed in America. But it does really remain to be answered why the UK and US have gone down such different routes. And I'll be happy to cover that later on. Can we move on, please? So what's next? Well, first thing is, my work in 2014 actually identified the big six issues, one of them being remuneration consultants. So there are 5 issues left. But also, in-house executive reward specialists are a hugely under-researched area, and one could do, I think, a really good piece of work on that, on how they work, their relationships, and what happens in practice, as opposed to any sort of black box that people look at from outside. Also, I think, needs looking at is emerging practices in financial services on executive pay in key financial centers worldwide. That's not just because I want to jump on a plane. At the moment, I couldn't do that. But I think that financial services remuneration practices are fascinating. For example, is the UK going to keep the EU bonus cap, etc.? Once I've done my first book, an independent external reviewer suggested that if I'm going to do a second one on the future of executive pay more broadly, covering other BSI issues, then I should do that with a US co-author, because really executive pay is very much US focused, with the UK coming well behind, but really being quite well up there with Cadbury, Greenbury and all that sort of stuff. But also the EU is coming up the rails, and there's far more stuff to talk about there, and also in the Middle East and Far East. So I'll need to find a co-author to help me with that. Catherine was laughing when I explained to her that I've been invited to collaborate on the screenplay for a feature film on an executive pay dilemma called Trouble in a City Boardroom, where the part I would be spending most of my time writing would be that of the remuneration consultant advising a bank and scratching his or her head on what on earth does one do in such a high stakes situation. That just about covers my present research. I hope you've got some question. And I think what Catherine's been doing is she's been sort of gathering the chat box situation together. And if she's collated those, Catherine, would you like to read them out? And then I'll do my best to answer them. I'm also going to have a sip of water, if that's all right.
That's great. Thank you very much, Calvin. That was a very interesting and enlightening discussion. I've learned a lot myself as well. There's a first question from Ben Norman. I don't know, Ben, if you'd like to read the question out loud yourself and open your microphone, or whether you want me to read the question for you.
Hello, can you hear me?
We can, yes.
Yes, thank you.
Right, sorry, a ghostly image. I quite haven't got my lighting as sorted as you have. It slightly horrifies me that you're recording this as a result. So my name is Ben Norman. I work at the Bank of England. I'm no longer in the regulatory part of the Bank of England, but I used to be. And I noticed on that final slide you mentioned about financial services remuneration. I had a more general question. REMCOs, as you know, of regulated financial services firms in the UK are subject to rules set by the Prudential Regulation Authority and the Financial Conduct Authority. I was interested to know if in the course of your research or other practice, you've picked up on differences in the sort of remuneration consultancy that's provided to financial services firms because of that regulation. And if so, what are the sort of main differences that you've observed?
That's an interesting question, because I used to advise right the way across the piece, whether it was a large manufacturing company, a drug company, or an investment bank. And but probably since I left the scene, there is more specialization, because we used to have, to some extent, that I used to be in a team that would advise financial services companies. But I guess these days, if the consultancy is large enough, they probably do, particular consultants probably do nothing but advise financial services firms. I think the basic skills are exactly the same, because to be a consultant, what do you need? You need technical knowledge, you need boardroom presence, and you need a really good knowledge of what the institutional shareholders think and what the regulators think about things. And I think that applies right the way across the piece, save that in financial services, you really do need to know your way around the remuneration handbooks if you're going to advise a bank or whatever. But I don't think you need to be fundamentally a different sort of consultant. I particularly like to advise financial services company. One of the reasons was simply my wife was used to be in investment banking, and also was a city headhunter. And so I used to get financial services at me even when I went home at night. And so I sort of grew up with it and was particularly interested in it. So have I answered your question there, Ben?
Yes. Can I have one follow-up though?
Oh, so it's like question time with Boris and Whitty and the other fellow, isn't it? Yeah, go ahead.
No, I feel I'm getting a much more straightforward set of answers. My follow-up, I suppose the subtext of what I was asking is often consultants are used more generally, I'm not talking about remuneration consultants, for many purposes. And sometimes they're used to find ways around or to sort of, I don't know, cut corners for firms. And I just wondered whether those remuneration consultants who are specializing in financial services firms or advising financial services firms more generally, whether there was any sense you'd picked up that that was part of the consultancy that they were providing to the firms, given, you know, that there are these quite tight rules around financial services remuneration.
There were some issues raised. The classic one, not specifically financial services, would be that there was a rash, apparently, of company executives, like the CEO, financial director, or whatever. He would receive, or she would receive, unsolicited pay ranges from a firm of consultants. So the consultants weren't advising the committee at all. And of course, that would really muck up the relationship the committee and the appointed consultants had, because the pay ranges were inevitably showing that the CEO was dramatically underpaid. And some of the regulators and the institutional shareholder bodies said, we don't like this being done. And it actually transpired that when the remuneration consultants group did a questionnaire to remuneration committee chairs, it did actually come up that this was going on, and they stamped on it. And in the most recent review they did, there wasn't a single example of that having been done. But there were other examples of where it was felt in institutional shareholder body meetings that the consultants sort of took over the meeting from the chair of the remuneration committee or the company chair and started advocating in particular ways for a certain type of scheme, the performance measures, the calibration, all that sort of thing. And the institutional shareholder bodies really hated that, to the point of asking them to leave the room while they spoke with the chair of the remuneration committee. But on the whole, if we had done this exercise not in 2016, but 1995 or 2000, we may have found the behavior was nowhere near as good. And some of the American behavior, like the Grasso affair, chair of the New York Stock Exchange, 2007, with the consultancy involved. The consultancy involved didn't come out smelling of roses, quite frankly. So I'd be a liar if I said that no one ever, in any circumstances, cut corners. But actually, the market determines pretty quickly whether consultants are honest Joes, as it were. Again, I always ask people if I've answered the question, because I always like people to feel that they've taken the trouble to ask a question, that they've got their money's worth, as it were.
Yeah, no, this is one of the best of these online forums that I've experienced, precisely because there's this live interaction and you're a very generous answerer of questions. So thank you, I did find that very interesting. I don't have anything further other than to say I am genuinely excited by this feature film that you're contributing to. I was doing some technical assistance with some central banks in emerging market economies, and one of the tools that we're quite keen to use is for training purposes, films that illustrate some of the boardroom challenges, and I don't think I've got one that covers remuneration issues, so I will be on the lookout for this as well. So thank you very much.
It's a pleasure. Well, what I would say is that Catriane's got my email. If you do want a bit of input of some sort, I'm happy to have a chat. Because before, on the collaboration, I was asked to submit 20 anecdotes showing what conflicts of interest there were and how they might be solved and what terrible problems arose. It sounds as if one of those might be quite suitable for you.
Sounds great.
I've put my email in Ben. I've put my email in the chat.
Oh, brilliant!
So feel free to send me.
Right. Next question.
I would like to ask a question myself, Calvin, if I can abuse the privilege. So I'm wondering, you just briefly touched upon the market structure of these firms, how it's different in the UK and the US, where in the UK, if I understand correctly, you have sort of less boutiques and sort of bigger firms at the moment, while in the US it's a bit different. And I was wondering, because I'm trying to make a parallel in my head with credit rating agencies, where sometimes you can read the argument that the fact that you have only a few credit rating agencies actually makes them less vulnerable to sort of conflicts of interest, because they're being paid by the issuer of a bond, for example, because they because there's only a few of them, and it's difficult to become a credit rating agency. They actually are a bit independent. As long as they don't mess it up completely, people will keep hiring them. So I'm wondering what your perspective is of the role of market structure to sort of manage conflicts of interests for executive remuneration consultants. Then a second question I had is what you think the role is of sort of improving the requirements, the experience requirements for these consultants, and sort of improving our knowledge on executive education, because executive remuneration, apologies, because there's a lot of, I mean, stock-based for compensation, it's not 100% clear how that should be calculated. How do we get incentives right, especially, for example, after crisis, there was so much debate on how to ensure that we take less risks as a bank and how to ensure executives takes less risks. So I was wondering whether you see a role for consultants to actually, by ensuring they have the right experience, that they have the necessary professional standards, that could improve our knowledge and on executive compensation. So that's my second question.
Okay, can I answer them in reverse order, please?
Yes.
In terms of, I am a firm believer that the way you pay people can make them do the right things or the wrong things. It's a very, very powerful tool. And it's very powerful because the people you are appealing to, company management, have got a particular interest in business and pay and making a lot of money. So you really have to be very careful the way you do things. And the way the UK has got things at the moment, with the arguments about restricted shares, whether they should replace long-term incentive plans, what the balance is between short and long-term incentives. At the moment, I don't think we've got it right. There are all sorts of problems. For example, if we've got restricted shares, you're taking quite a lot of the risk out of the package. Some institutional shareholders rather like that because the management aren't going to bet the store. But you're taking the risk out, and the main part of the package with risk in then becomes the short-term incentive. Well, does that make sense? Because you may be encouraging people to do things for the short term with a lot of money attached and not the long term. And anyway, are restricted shares a crypto pension plan? Are we going back to the days when a CEO had a 2/3 after 20 years pension plan, 2/3 of final remuneration? And that was the major part of the package. That's why they stayed. All that disappeared. Is it now coming back? So I think knowledge of pay and the way you can change behavior with pay is massively important. In terms of experience of consultants, it's really weird because I've never been able to identify who's going to be a good consultant and what makes a good consultant and what sort of background have they got. They come from all sorts, and I think the best consultants are used to working in a team. For example, I'm not saying I'm one of the best or was one of the best, but I used to work with my actuarial colleagues or with tax colleagues, and they would bring to the party something that I didn't have, and the combination of the two was very powerful indeed. And so it isn't just a matter of years of experience, it's actually having a team where they can all bring the right experience to bear. And at the moment, one of the issues is that a lot of the old guard consultants are retiring, and there are fewer and fewer and fewer people to replace them with, because the payment structure, making no bones about it, all these firms virtually used to be unlimited liability partnerships, and they paid extremely well. Mm-hmm. Now most of them have gone corporate, mm-hmm. becoming LLPs or whatever, or quoted on stock exchanges, where the earnings potential is nowhere near as good, except in the big four firms where the partnership model is still there. So actually getting people to stay long enough to develop the experience is actually becoming, in my view, quite problematic. And to go on to your first question, the market structure. Now, I wrote down market structure, but just remind me, was it why there are different types of firms?
So why there are different types, but also, do you think one structure is better than the other when it comes to managing conflicts of interest? As you yes. could sort of similarly see with credit rating agencies, that they say that because there's only a few of them, they actually are not too reliant on their clients, and so they don't have to sort of cater for their needs as much, so that reduces conflict of interest.
Well, I look pretty closely at not just the credit rating agencies, but also the proxy advisors, who are very, very similar in terms of the proxy advisors. It's ISS, Glass Lewis, and that's about it, really. When you look at the remuneration consultancies, I constantly found that there was less concern about conflicts than I anticipated, but people were very, very interested in getting really sound commercial advice. So it was the quality of the advice and the quality of the advisor that took precedence. And back in 2016, PwC and Deloitte, offering a one-stop shop in many respects, were very much dominating the market. In other words, their clients were very appreciative of the broad range of services on a global basis. And the actuarial and benefit consultants is much the same thing. But the boutiques, they are really coming along in the UK. And it may be, and of course what the boutiques have is the mono service line argument. We only do one thing, and we do that really well. We advise remuneration committees. We don't talk to you about anything else at all. And therefore, you know, we're not trying to sell you anything else. We know we're not being influenced by any other considerations, etc. Now, in the States, the boutiques now dominate the market. And the independence argument had something to do with it. But what really, really turbocharged it was the 2009 SEC provisions, which basically meant the disclosure provisions for fees charged were so much less aggressive for mono service line boutiques. And therefore, you'll see really big companies in the States advised by tiny, tiny boutique firms of consultants. They don't have to disclose the level of fees and all sorts of other things, which may be good, it may be bad, I don't know. But they stress the independent argument. And I thought that wouldn't come to the fore in the UK, but it's just starting to come. I can see it coming along. And there were clients in my day, banks I advised, who said, the reason we're hiring you is that you don't provide as a firm any other advice whatsoever. And if you ever do provide such advice, unless you have our permission, we'll sack you. So they did value independence, but there wasn't a lot of that going on. I think there's more now, and that may be to do with that many of the really, really senior consultants have now gone to small boutiques. So you're getting the independence, plus you're getting really experienced consultants. I answered your question, as I say, I asked that to everyone.
You did, actually, you did. I'm satisfied. Right. So I see we're running out of time. So I really want to thank you, Calvin. This was really a super presentation. I really enjoyed it. I feel like I can ask you a million more questions. So thank you very much.
That's very kind. And thank you to everyone for joining in.
Yes, looking forward to the book and the film. of course.
Yeah,
so
book first, film later.
first, film later. That's always how it happens. You first need to read the book before.
You've got to do the book and then you do the film. Yeah.
Anyway, thank you very much, Calvin. It was a pleasure to have you.
Well, thank you very much.
Have a
Bye
good
now.
evening, everybody. Bye.